Okay, so we are beginning our American history course with the most important chapter, and that is the chapter on Reconstruction. Reconstruction is the most important because it is the foundation for our understanding on why American history is the way it is after the Civil War. What most people don't realize is that Reconstruction is the 12 years after the Civil War, where the American people, from its leaders all the way down to its citizens, have the opportunity to try again, to start all over. And that's why the theme for this particular lecture is to start all over. And what many people assume is that starting over is primarily for the South, right? Because you think that's where the war was primarily, and that's where the destruction and the violence took place. That's where everything needs to be reconstructed, so to say, or so to speak. However, Reconstruction is really about the entire country. Starting over was about the entire country fixing itself and correcting its mistakes in order to become the democracy and the real, fulfilling its real potential that it could have been. Unfortunately, what we will see is that these issues of racism, economic inequality, and gender inequality, political division, all of those issues were too deeply entrenched, and that people could not get past those issues and were not willing to do the work to get past those issues in order to truly move on and fulfill the great potential of uh, what the country had hoped to become. What you're going to realize over the course of not only our discussion for this chapter, but the chapters to come throughout this class, is that what we discuss here in Reconstruction is going to come up over and over and over again in multiple chapters. That's why Reconstruction is the most important chapter. It is an opportunity to learn and grow, but it is a missed opportunity because they don't. So, with that in mind, let's set up the context of what is taking place before Reconstruction really takes hold in the nation. Let's talk about the concept of a civil war. I want to talk about that because people underestimate the trauma of war. Most of you are familiar with war primarily because you have been born into a country that has known only war. But the difference between this war that you've been born into, this time of war, and the war that we're talking about now is that the time of war that you have been born into has been with another country. It has been with a foreign enemy. In this particular case, we are talking about a civil war, right? And when we are talking about a civil war, it is an American against an American, right? It is brother against brother. It is friend against friend. And in these times, when you are talking about divisions, even along political lines, there is a lot of scary ideas of, what is this going to lead to? What if this leads to violence? And that in and of itself is frightening and intimidating. But when it leads to actual war, it's overwhelming. It's particularly overwhelming and traumatic when you are talking about it in actual deaths, because there is a political cost an economic cost, and a social cost, right? So let's talk about what it looks like in actual numbers. In 1860, according to the census, the population of the United States was roughly around 30 million. Now, in terms of directly tied to the war, the common accepted number of the dead is somewhere around 625,000 people. That's roughly 2 to 3% of the total population. So if we were to translate that to present day numbers, we're talking current population numbers is somewhere around 315 million people. So keep in mind, I'm going to go back for a second. If you were to go to the commonly accepted total number of dead, keep in mind that's specifically to the war, right? We're not talking about the number of people who were sick or died of disease or starvation and poverty. That's directly tied to the war. Now, if you look at the current population and take 2 to 3% of that, that would translate to 6 to 9 million people. That is real drama and trauma when it comes to economic impact, when it comes to political impact, right? Because these are people who are working people. These are people who would vote. These are people who are going to have a real social impact. Think about what your communities would look like with that many people dying, that many people who wouldn't show up to, community events, schools, churches, community gatherings. That's a real traumatic loss. And it does something to the national identity overall. As the country and as the world is still dealing with the aftermath and even still reeling from the pandemic, this is a very real issue that we're dealing with present day. It is something that you cannot easily walk away from, right? And so with that trauma fresh in people's minds, you have to also consider this. There are now 4 million people who are transitioning from enslaved to free. So 4 million people in the South who are no longer considered property and now walking around as free men and women. Okay? And that's going to be incredibly important as you enter into your textbook on page 565, as Professor Foner writes about the meaning of freedom. And this is where you are going to take over as students and start to read and take notes. What I want you to understand is that freedom isn't just a concept. Freedom means multiple things. Freedom is not just about being free. Freedom has multiple meanings. And when we are talking about formerly enslaved people, freedom has a social aspect among other issues. Like, for example, he talks about things like having their own churches, going to school. Why would churches be important to Black people? Well, because the church represented multiple things. The church was where they could worship freely. Certainly that was important to them. But church also represented a place where they could express themselves freely, not just in worship, but also in political opinion. Church was also a place where they could economically connect with each other. Church would be a central place of community gatherings. Ministers would become important because ministers would become their community leaders. So churches were much more than just places of worship. Churches were a place where they would find their identities as a people. So when we talk about the significance of the Black church, what you have to understand is that not just during Reconstruction, but for decades to come, the Black church would be incredibly vital for Black Americans, which is why even in the 1960s and the 1970s, Black ministers would be civil rights leaders. This is primarily why. Why are schools important for Black Americans? Because schools and education would be the key to enlightenment. And enlightenment was empowerment, right? Education was the key to your way out of your poverty, certainly. But it was also the key to your understanding of who you are, right? Keep in mind that for generations now, for centuries at this point, these formerly enslaved people had no real sense of their own identity outside of what they had to create for themselves. And now they had access to knowledge, and knowledge is power. And that was incredibly important because with that power came freedom. Okay. In addition to that, there was this need for freedom through economics. There are a couple of places where you can read more about this, right? That's on page 568, but it's also on page 571, where he talks about the Freedmen's Bureau, as well as on page 574, where he talks about the white farmer. And I want you to read about the white farmer as well, because I want you to understand that poor Blacks in the South have more in common with poor whites in the South than poor whites had in common with other white people. And this is something that a lot of people dismiss because a lot of people want to believe that white people had more in common with other white people because of racial issues. And that's not true at all. Just because they were white didn't mean that they shared the same interests. What ends up happening is a lot of poor Blacks, because of their age and because of their interests, continued on in agricultural work because that's all they knew. But the agricultural work that they were subjected to was something called sharecropping. And I'm going to show you in the next slide what that sharecropping would do, because sharecropping, as you will read, kept them in poverty. And that's something that poor white Southerners would also be stuck in. They would also be stuck in a perpetual cycle of poverty. And that's something that they had in common with poor Black people. And we'll talk about how that's going to be significant. Now, another layer of freedom for Black Americans was political freedom. Now, political freedom is so important because it wasn't just about being free from slavery. It was also about being recognized as a part of society, not just being free and free from the institution of slavery, but being included into society. What does that mean? That means citizenship. And not just being citizens, but being included or having the rights of citizens. That's going to mean voting rights. And voting rights means not just being able to vote, but also being able to run for office, also being able to contribute to the conversations about government, contributing to the narrative. That's what it's about. Okay. Now, when we talk about the larger implications of what that freedom looks like. What I mean by that is, and Foner talks about this, is what that means for larger society, right? For the white communities around them. And you're going to learn about that in the sections where he talks about land reform and the New South, right? And where he talks about the white farmer and things like that. What I want you to understand, especially, is when he gets into the economic interests of racism, specifically of why plantation owners needed slavery, that it wasn't just a matter of them being racist, and it wasn't just a matter of, well, we don't know how to work the land, that's why we need slaves. No, 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 no. It was way more than that. Slavery is what kept plantation owners in power. And what I want you to understand is this. Not all white people in the South were plantation owners. In fact, the plantation owner population is a very small percentage of Southern white people. We're talking about 10%, 10 to 15% of Southern whites were plantation owners. It's a very small percentage. But the key to being a plantation owner is that not only do you have access to a huge amount of land, you controlled a large percentage of wealth. So you could afford to purchase slaves. You could afford to own slaves. A vast majority of white people in the South were either small farmers or poor Southern whites who couldn't afford any land at all, let alone slaves. There's no way. That's the vast majority of white people in the South. There was no way that they could be any kind of, or have access to any kind of real wealth. And if you didn't have wealth, you didn't have power. And that's the thing. Plantation owners needed slavery not just to preserve their wealth, they needed slavery to preserve their power. And so what they did was they convinced poor white people in the South that slavery was important for all of them because slavery helped them stay superior. Slavery was about racial superiority. And that's what kept them in charge, right? When we talk about plantation owners did an excellent job of convincing poor Southern whites of fighting against their own interest. And it's really a tragedy because poor Southern whites had way more in common than enslaved peoples and later on poor Southern blacks because uh, uh, because they were all in the same boat. They were all struggling. They were all in the struggle together. They couldn't afford anything. And yet, what plantation owners had successfully done is convince poor Southern whites that because they were all white, that that's all that mattered. And that simply just was not true. Okay, so here is the guide to show you, I encourage you to pause this slide when you can, but it shows you the struggle, the cycle of poverty for a sharecropper. I encourage you to take a moment to read through this and see what a struggle this is. So, with that in mind, I want to talk to you a little bit about what Republicans have in mind when it comes to Reconstruction. So, Republicans in Congress really sort of clash every once in a while with Abraham Lincoln about his plans on how to reconstruct or rebuild the South. Because Republicans in Congress really want to punish the South. Abraham Lincoln goes back and forth. And then, of course, in April of 1865, Lincoln was assassinated. And unfortunately for the whole country, Lincoln is replaced by this disaster, Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson is just really not capable of doing the job. He is a Southern Democrat from Tennessee, and the reason why Lincoln chooses Johnson as his vice president is because he's hoping to appease the South and say, "Hey guys, look, I've chosen a Southern Democrat. He's one of you guys. Don't you like him?" No, nobody likes him. Andrew Johnson is just not capable of being a good, solid leader. Andrew Johnson is one of these guys who cannot be entrusted with a job of this capacity. Shows up to his own inauguration completely in the bag, totally drunk, slurring his own inaugural address, randomly starts calling out people. It's a disaster. And it's pretty clear to Republicans in Congress that this guy has no real interest in actually doing anything productive for Reconstruction, and he's definitely not going to do anything for the benefit of Black Americans. And so, in the meantime, what Southerners have been doing is they've been pushing their own agenda by establishing, as Foner talks about on page 579, the Black Codes. The Black Codes were basically their way of pushing or reestablishing their own racial authority, right? They're trying to reestablish their old way of living and essentially say, we don't care that slavery is over. We want to make sure that you, Black people, know your place in Southern society. And so when these are established, immediately Republicans are like, okay, these people are out of control. We need to get to work right away. And so what they do is they start pushing for civil rights legislation, which Foner gets into on page 581, with the first real civil rights bill, which is pushed for or introduced in 1866. And he explains what that is, so make sure you read up on it. But what is born out of it is the Civil Rights Bill, which will become the 14th Amendment. Now, he will talk about the 13th Amendment a little earlier than this. The 13th Amendment is initially introduced by Abraham Lincoln. And that's what abolishes slavery. I want you to know what the Reconstruction Amendments are. So the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. The 14th, which is originally the Civil Rights Bill of 1866, the 14th Amendment is what establishes citizenship for all those born in the United States, except for Native Americans. And the 15th, which he eventually explains on page 585. The 15th is what grants men the right to vote, just men. Okay, so the 13th, and it goes in logical order, if that helps. So the abolishment of slavery, citizenship, and then the right to vote. Okay, so when we talk about these Reconstruction amendments, they are incredibly important because essentially what they are doing is they are giving these political freedoms to Black men, which is incredibly, incredibly important. But in the meantime, you do have opposition from Andrew Johnson, who is not at all interested in granting these rights to freed peoples. And so in response to that, Republicans know that they have to find a way to control Andrew Johnson. And so they introduce what is called the Tenure of Office Act, which for some reason I have on here twice. I apologize. The Tenure of Office Act is important because it is their attempt at controlling Andrew Johnson. I talk about it, or Foner talks about it on page 584. And when he mentions it, he talks about how Johnson violates that act, and because he violates it, he is immediately brought up on charges of impeachment. Uh, when he is brought up on charges of impeachment, the trial goes to the Senate, and he is one vote shy of being removed from office. That's all, just one vote. So it's clear that Republicans did want to get him out of office. And by sheer dumb luck, he is not removed. So let's talk about how Reconstruction actually works in the South. What's absolutely brilliant and fascinating is that Black men who were enslaved make this wonderful transition of going from slave to office holder. And what's fascinating to watch is that there were plenty of people who thought, believed, suggested that these formerly enslaved men, would either be too shy, or they would be too ignorant, or they wouldn't understand how to lead, how to contribute, or how to do anything. But at the first opportunity they had to contribute to the narrative, they took it. And that's what was so brilliant about these opportunities. Here's something that I want you to keep in mind. When we talk about these chances to lead, these states that had taken themselves out of the Union, they had seceded out of the Union to fight in the Civil War. In order to come back into the Union, they had to create brand new constitutions. And in order to do that, they had to have state constitutional conventions and create all of these things. So Black men were running for state office. They were running for, they had become state legislators. They were running for lieutenant governor. They were running for all of these offices, and they were winning. The men that you see in this lithograph here, one of them is actually a senator, and the others are congressmen at the federal level. In Louisiana, there was a Black lieutenant governor and several legislators. This is happening throughout the South. So the whole point of that is for you to understand, and Foner talks about this on page 592, that Black men didn't just sit on the sidelines and watch things happen. They actively participated. So it goes to show you that they wanted to be a part of American society and American politics. They wanted to help lead, right? And that's the point. They did not want to just sit back. They wanted to contribute to the conversation. And it shows that throughout the South, there were changes in who was leading, right? So on page 593, Foner talks about how there were other shifts in power. He mentions carpetbaggers and scalawags. Carpetbaggers were Northern Republicans who saw political opportunities in the South and decided to take advantage of them. And scalawags were Southern Republicans who saw opportunities and decided to take advantage of them as well. All of these people were seeing opportunities and thought, okay, this is a chance to really take up opportunities for leadership. But this doesn't last for very long, right? Because what Republicans in Washington, D.C. don't realize or underestimate is the fact that not everyone is thrilled about Reconstruction. Not everybody wants to get behind the idea of Reconstruction. And this is where Foner starts talking about the opponents to Reconstruction, starting on page 595. When we talk about those who opposed Reconstruction, here's what I want you to keep in mind. Racism isn't just in the South. Racism is not just a Southern problem. Racism is an American problem, period. It's a national issue. And there were plenty of Northerners who had a problem with Black men sitting in positions of power. There were plenty of Northerners who did not like that Black men were in Congress, that Black men were starting to earn money, that Black men were getting an education. They did not like that Black men considered themselves the equals of white men. And again, you're going to see this echoed in lectures to come. So keep this in mind. And so these Northerners are going to ally themselves with Southerners in different ways to oppose the Reconstruction agenda. Another thing to keep in mind is that you will have the rise of a brand new organization established in 1866 called the Ku Klux Klan. And Foner talks about them on page 596. On page 596, you will learn about the Ku Klux Klan, which is a terrorist organization established by a former Confederate general, Nathan Bedford Forrest. And their primary responsibility was to terrorize Black Southerners and Southern Republicans and any other Republican trying to establish Republican rule in the South. And basically, their responsibility was to try and reestablish the old Southern way of life. And in the meantime, there was this new branch of Republicans that Foner talks about on page 597, the liberal Republicans, who thought that Reconstruction's agenda had come to an end. It had not, but they wanted to bring it to an end. Liberal Republicans wanted to focus on other issues. Because they believed, and to a certain extent they were right, they believed that Northerners didn't care anymore. And to a certain extent, again, they were right. A vast majority of Northerners were focused on other issues. Many of them thought, listen, we have other things that we need to focus on. We need to focus on the economy. We need to focus on what's going on out west with violence breaking out with the Plains Indians and expansion. We don't have time for the South anymore. And we don't care about what's going on in the South. And then there's the rise of the Redeemers. And the Redeemers were people in the South who were wealthy and, of course, white, but people who were also wanting to regain power. And these were the people who were going to align themselves with those Northern power elites, right? So these were Southern elites who were wanting to reestablish themselves as the powerful and the wealthy. And essentially, they call themselves the Redeemers, as Foner explains on page 599, as a way to redeem or bring back the South of old. What happens as a result is that the combination of all of these things will lead to a problem with the presidential election of 1876, with the fact that Reconstruction loses a lot of momentum. And because it loses a lot of momentum, Republicans realize, oh man, that means that we better compromise on a lot of things, and we have to stop focusing all of our attention on this and focus on other things instead. And as a result, as you will read on page 600 and 601, you'll read about how not only do they compromise, they bring about an end to Reconstruction itself. Now, that leads me to this very important point. Foner, throughout the chapter, is going to mention this phrase, the boundaries of freedom. And we're going to hear that phrase in a few more chapters as well. The boundaries of freedom. And that's going to refer to how freedom is limited. It's limited depending on who you're talking to. It's going to be limited depending on what your race is. It's going to be limited depending on what your gender is. It'll be limited depending on what your socioeconomic status is. It's going to be limited depending on what your sexual identity is, or your religion is. It will be limited depending on all sorts of issues. And that sort of thinking is reinforced here in Reconstruction. It's a painful lesson that African Americans learn here in Reconstruction, that while they are free from the institution of slavery, they are not entirely free. And that's what I want you to remember as we go forward for the rest of the semester.